So Prime Minister Narendra Modi has landed in Brazil for the G20 Summit. He is there, of course, along with a number of world leaders, including President Joe Biden of the United States, China's President Xi Jinping, of course, and the host leader, Brazil's Luis Inácio Lula da Silva. Of course, we just know him as Lula. So this is just coming off the back of what we talked to you about yesterday, which is the Prime Minister's three-nation tour, where she started just a couple of days ago. He started with Nigeria. He's now in Brazil for the G20 Summit. He moves on to Guyana. But I just wanted to, sit down with you guys, sit down and have a chat about what he achieved while he was in Nigeria. This is a visit that ended yesterday, as well as with what is set to happen over the next couple of days and in terms of the diplomatic agenda of the Prime Minister. So basically in Nigeria, Prime Minister Narendra Modi was honored with the Nigeria's second highest civilian honor, which is the Grand Commander of the Niger. This is, of course, an award that was given to Queen Elizabeth as well way back in 1969. So Prime Minister Narendra Modi has received this honor. He is also was really in Nigeria to push India's relationship forward with a crucial African nation. This African nation, of course, Nigeria in West Africa has a population of over 200 million people. We explained yesterday that in terms of defense, security, energy, oil, so on, is a very, very important country in Africa, and India has tried to expand its relationship with Africa, given the fact that not only is there a decades-long political relationship there, but there is also a significant defense and security relationship. There is also a $100 billion trade relationship with a number of, with the African continent as a whole, with Nigeria. Nigeria is about 15 billion of that, so around 15% of India's trade with Africa is Nigeria. So an important country. Now, what exactly was achieved during this visit? India and Nigeria agreed to collaborate on counterterrorism, maritime security, and intelligence sharing. This is important. Nigeria has also had a major problem with terrorism in the past, with terror groups like Boko Haram. These are African-based Islamist terrorist groups. India and Nigeria, of course, have agreed now to work together much more on protecting maritime trade routes in the Gulf of Guinea as well as in the Indian Ocean. So this is again a significant development in that sense, because India is looking for more partners. We've already gone ahead and worked on a joint vision with Kenya, which is in East Africa, also another major and important player in the geopolitics of Africa. India has a strong relationship with Kenya, now of course building up a strong relationship with Nigeria. India has also had a strong defense relationship in the past with Nigeria. It helped set up its National Defense Academy, its National War College. And so one of the big takeaways from Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit was on defense and security, this collaboration on maritime security, counterterrorism, and intelligence sharing. Moving on, also there was economic cooperation. The idea was that the two countries would discuss more on economic development, food security, healthcare, but energy really, because what India is looking for is diversified sources of energy from around the world. India imports over 80% of its crude oil requirements from other countries in the world. So Russia is a big source of supply for India. A number of Middle Eastern countries like Iraq are a key source of supply. India also purchases from other countries in the world. So Nigeria is absolutely one among them. India does purchase energy from Nigeria, but it's looking to expand those cooperations because it wants to have a really diversified set of relationship. Because if one country or a couple of countries have supply your energy to you and you're dependent on them, that gives them geopolitical leverage over you. And the history of the politics of energy over the last couple of decades is really that history, which is that it doesn't pay to be totally dependent on a couple of countries. India has had problems like this in the past. We used to buy a lot of oil from Iran, then they were sanctioned by the Americans. We had to cut off oil purchases from them. Then we, of course, had a strong relationship with Venezuela. Venezuela was sanctioned by the Americans. We've had a problem there as well. So there are these concerns, and India wants to diversify its sources of energy. So energy and economic cooperation, one of the big areas of focus for this visit for this visit of Prime Minister Modi to Nigeria. And finally, trade as well, some cooperation on finalizing some trade agreements in terms of economic cooperation, bilateral investment, and so on and so forth. Remember, as I said, Indian companies have there's around $27 billion of investment in that sense between the two countries. And India is, of course, looking to enhance its economic presence in Nigeria. The big concern, of course, is that and Africa more generally was a sphere of the world where 30, 40 years ago, India had a fairly established set of relationships. But China seems to have very, very significantly stolen a march over India. India has deep established relationships. India has, like I said, $100 billion trade relationship, billions of dollars in investments, but it has paled in comparison to what China has established over the last 30 to 40 years, of course, as a consequence of its economic growth. But I can tell you personally, sitting down with some Indian businessmen who operate in Africa, who've been there for decades, saying that, 20, 30 years ago, India was really, you would have expected India to have the whip hand when it came to Africa and cooperating with Africa. But China has really arrived in the last 20, 30 years, especially in the last 10, 15 years in Africa, funded major projects. The Belt and Road Initiative was very, very prominent there in terms of infrastructure investments, in terms of political relationships with African countries, in terms of developing natural resources. And so the sense was from many Indian businessmen that India had the advantage. It has let it go to China. Of course, now India is trying to develop those relationships and try to expand those relationships as its economy grows as well. And that, of course, also explains the second half of the visit, which is now we get into Brazil. Having left Nigeria behind, we can move to Brazil. The Prime Minister is there, of course, for the G20 Summit. And India held the presidency of the G20 Summit last year. This, of course, is going to be India's time at as part of the governing troika of the G20. As I explained yesterday, the governing structure of the G20 is that the country that holds the presidency in a particular year, that is Brazil, is supported by the country that held the presidency in the past year, which is India, and the country that will hold it in the next year, which is South Africa. So this makes a string of developing countries who have worked on the G20 and have held the presidency of the G20 and get to set the agenda of the G20. So that's very, very interesting. Now, of course, what the Prime Minister is going to be doing today is he is going to be there at the launch of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. This is a major factor for this G20. One of the big takeaways of this G20 is going to be this global alliance, of course, following on India's work and Indonesia's work in spotlighting the problems of the global south. As I was pointing out yesterday, if you had joined us on our live, that the big problem that a lot of developing countries face right now is, you may have heard about this sustainable development goals, which is the idea that countries would move towards improving healthcare, improving social development, improving economic growth, improving the ordinary lives of their citizens, whether it was in various healthcare outcomes, in terms of climate, in terms of reducing the malevolent impacts of climate change, ensuring better healthcare outcomes, more education, more gender equity, so on and so forth. These were the ideas of the Sustainable Development Goals. Unfortunately, while we saw much progress over the last couple of decades, the problem is that over the last couple of years, and especially since the COVID-19 pandemic, lots of countries have actually backtracked, have fallen back on those goals. A lot of human development progress that has been made over the last couple of decades has been wiped out because of the COVID-19 pandemic, because of the levels of debt that countries had to take on, because of the absolute decimation to the lives and livelihoods of a lot of people, especially in the most vulnerable countries in the world, because of what happened during COVID-19. So that is an absolute concern, and that's why G20, you may have heard about the Global South, but I just want to give you the background as to why you're hearing this so much, because there is an acute crisis in a number of developing countries around the world. They have seen their standards of living, their people fall back into poverty, and the governments are now increasingly indebted. They are facing the worst impacts of climate change, and they don't have the resources or the money to pay back their debts, let alone return to the levels of development progress that they were seeing a couple of years ago. And so that's why everyone from Indonesia to India to Brazil and hopefully South Africa as well is going to focus on the problems of the global south. That's what the G20 has been trying to highlight. So you're going to have Prime Minister Narendra Modi at the launch of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. Today we're also going to see the sessions where leaders speak. There's going to be the fight against hunger and poverty. There's going to be a working lunch. There's going to be another session on the reform of institutions of global governance. Prime Minister Modi is also going to be taking some bilateral meetings. And we shall have to see what those bilateral meetings are. Some conversation about whether he will be meeting, of course, probably with the host leader, of course, President Lula of Brazil, but also some conversation about whether he will see other world leaders, such as President Joe Biden of the United States, who's, of course, outgoing. This could be their last meeting before Joe Biden leaves office. Of course, President Xi Jinping of China, they, of course, met very recently on the sidelines of the BRICS summit in Kazan in Russia. We'll have to see if something else happens. And of course, tomorrow is another day. They have another set of sessions and meetings and a set of bilateral meetings that the Prime Minister will be looking to fill. And tomorrow evening, he then leaves and heads off to Georgetown, to Guyana, to meet with the leadership of Guyana, a country that is very important for India's foreign policy. We'll, of course, explain that as well. But also, we will explain a little bit about the India CARICOM summit that is also going to be happening, which is India meeting with the leaderships of Caribbean nations. I started by talking to you about Modi's visit to Nigeria, his attempt to focus more of a light on Africa, a part of the world that India wants to engage with much more strongly. Latin America and the Caribbean are also areas of the world that India wants to engage in more strongly, and that's what we're going to see over the next couple of days. That's all I have for you right now, but we will absolutely keep you updated on the latest developments on Prime Minister Modi's visit to Brazil. There's going to be a lot that is going to be discussed over the next couple of days for the agenda of the Global South, for the agenda of developing countries. We're going to see some big bilateral meetings with Prime Minister Modi, and we'll keep you absolutely updated here on India Today Global. Thanks for watching.